Welcome to The Sterile Room. This is a podcast geared toward all general surgery residents to discuss topics ranging from choosing a fellowship, performing a Coker maneuver, and to managing one's expectations during a grueling 5 years of residency. The goal of this podcast is to provide listeners with another line of education, but also, and more importantly, to discuss topics that are deemed taboo and hopefully sterilizing them. Thank you for tuning in. All right, guys. Well, welcome to the Sterile Room again. I know it's been quite a while since our last episode, but gosh, do we have quite a special guest today. And I know I say that a lot, but this guy is really a special guest. We got the Dr. John Fung here out of the Transplant Institute here at University of Chicago. He's done quite a bit in the world of transplant and immunology. Obviously, he did his medical school here at University of Chicago, also did his training in Rochester residency and internship, and then he did a fellowship at Pittsburgh. And of course, his Ph.D. is also gathered here at University of Chicago. Obviously, I can spend the next 30 minutes just giving all the accolades, but what inspires all of us every day is a story such as Dr. Fung's. And so I want to peer into the brain of one of our greatest surgeons. So, Dr. Fung, how do you pronounce tacrolimus? Is that correct? I've heard it say tacrolimus. Can you just clear the air with that first?
So some people call it tacrolimus, some call it tacrolimus. Some people call it FK506. You may hear that, but that's old terminology from when it was an experimental drug. But a lot of old timers like me still refer to it as FK.
All right, that's what I'm going to do then.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think first we're just going to get to sort of just about you. And so I think the first things first is, what do you do for fun? What are your hobbies?
So growing up, I didn't have many hobbies. In fact, it was kind of funny. It was just sitting this morning as I was driving to work, thinking about things that I did when I was a kid. There wasn't very much. Probably because my father was in the aerospace industry. He was involved in building the Saturn V rocket that put Apollo up on the moon. And then it was involved with B-1 bomber, the space station, a couple other things that at the time. I guess if I had a hobby when I was growing up, it was in model rocketry. But having said that, I really didn't know much about things that other people did, because all I did was study. But now, as I've gotten older, I've picked up some hobbies. So probably the one that I do most often, I enjoy it, is cooking. I love to cook. Now, because I like to cook, I have to work out. Otherwise, I'm going to look like a Santa Claus. So things that I do to work out, I pretty much try to work out every day. It got worse during COVID because there wasn't anything else to do but work out. So, it extended during that time to about 90 minutes of workout a day. I do that when I wake up at around 3:30 in the morning. Okay. I work out before I go to work and get here usually around 6 o'clock in the morning. I've picked up road biking. I do a fair amount of road biking. I alternate that indoors, outdoors with weightlifting and stuff like that. I fenced in college, and I still fence. I kind of screwed up my finger fencing, but in the old days it was more competitive. Now it's more recreational. I don't go to competitions like I used to, and it's more just to keep your mind sharp, and it's a good opportunity to work with younger people. Interestingly, I also played hockey when I was a resident in medical school, and but I don't play anymore. It just after having 2 hip replacements, it's pretty hard to. I mean, I skate pretty well, but I don't want to bang them up. Yep. And then the up and coming sport now, everybody plays pickleball. So and my wife's a big pickleball player, so I try to do that. And then travel, and that's part fun, part work. When I was training and when I ran the program in Pittsburgh in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000, transplantation was still a relatively new field. Particularly, people from all over the world were coming to Pittsburgh to learn about liver transplantation, and as a result, I would say, we trained thousands of transplant surgeons around the world, and but you keep in touch with them through connections and networking, and so I traveled, give grand rounds to get involved in review of programs, etc. And then more recently, in my position as president or officer of the Transplantation Society, which is a global society, been more involved in those kinds of global regional affairs and some issues. So, the traveling's been interesting, and as I've sort of looked at, now the later phase of my career, I've been doing transplantation since 1984, looking at slowing down a little bit clinically, and then just taking the opportunity to reach out to people that are in their later part of their career too. So, just it's been fun. Yeah,
that's awesome. So you're going to be the next Tour de France, and then did you ever get your hands insured? I mean, you're a surgeon and playing doing fencing.
So I have a pretty. I would advise you get a good disability policy.
Sure.
So I like to bike. I just earlier this year did a interesting trip to Vietnam and Cambodia. 10-day trip.
Sure, the topography was nice.
Yeah, boat-based bicycling tour, and it was kind of cool. We rode anywhere from 30 to 60 miles a day.
Nice.
It wasn't. I mean, if it was just a road thing, it would be challenging. But these were all on dirt paths, in the countryside, so it made it particularly challenging. And the temperatures, surprisingly, at the end of February in Vietnam, the highs were 100. It ranged from 105 to 110. So
I'm sure the humidity was pretty outstanding too.
Yeah, it wasn't as bad there as it is when they have rainy season, but it was tough. I mean, I don't think I've drank so much water and peed so little in my life. It was amazing.
You didn't need a kidney transplant.
Yeah. But that was exciting, and so on my bucket list, I would get the opportunity to travel. I would just tell all your listeners that take every opportunity you can, because the world changes. And one of the things that the first time I went to China after the Nixon opened up the doors was in 1986, and that was really exciting. And I go to China probably around 2 to 3 times a year for educational programs and stuff. And I also have some family, distant relatives that are still there. But just to watch the evolution of a country like that, it's been amazing. So, if you get a chance and travel, because it won't be the same way in 10 years or 5 years or whatever. And I think that's an exciting opportunity. It's also for me, as I said, watching the evolution of practice of transplantation in developing countries has also been fascinating.
Right.
A good transplant surgeon can be taught, or has the intrinsic, talent to do transplants. Doesn't matter if they're from, Kenya or, Australia or China or the United States or Europe. They have an understanding of relationships of and pathophysiology, etc. So the challenge is, how do you practice? How do you set up a program in a third world country that doesn't have the ICU settings and the ORs and all the toys that we have now? I was recently at a meeting in India, in Chennai. And in India, it's interesting because the proliferation of transplant programs now for liver just started only about 10, 15 years ago. Prior to that, they didn't have a transplant program. They're using living donors, which is, has its own pluses and minuses. Sure. But, they're able to do a liver transplant from a living donor for $30,000. Here in the United States, $30,000 wouldn't even get you through your evaluation process. The average liver transplant in the United States is close to $500,000, in terms of charges.
Sure.
So when you look at being able to do and their outcomes are very good, to be able to provide these services in globally in remote areas or indigent populations and things like that, it's really fascinating and makes you a little bit coming out of a developed country with all these resources, thinking these for them to do what they're able to do, it takes the commitment, and they need even more resources and more talent to get to do what they do than what we have.
Do more with less.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, that's outstanding. And then I was just thinking about it. So when we have patients that come in that are donors, living donors, that are just doing it, obviously they're all altruistic, but just giving to somebody they don't know. Do insurances cover that? Like I heard it, obviously they can't get paid for it because then that's obviously that's conflict of interest,
right,
et cetera. But how does that shake out
yeah,
financially?
So fortunately, and most insurances and even government programs, Medicare, Medicaid, will provide funding for the donor, regardless if it's a kidney or a liver. So they will cover that service, the expenses for the donor. Now, I think one of the challenges is, particularly, if you have a younger donor that may not have their own insurance or have a relatively poor quality insurance product, if their donation effort, the index hospitalization for that is covered entirely, but some of them may have long-term complications or long-term need for follow-up, and in that setting, if you don't have good insurance, that could be an issue, a barrier for their long-term health. So I think the society needs to come up with a better way to ensure that living donors that donate are cared for the best way they can.
Fair. Very good. And then I guess going back to my preset list of questions, but that was a lot of information, and thank you, of course. How was training back in your training of during general surgery residency and fellowship changed, do you think, comparison to current trainees and current residents? What do you think is the biggest, and sure you can harp on the hours and on all that, but truly, what do you think is the biggest difference between if you were to redo residency now?
I'm not sure if I could compete with the residents coming in now. I mean, they're so talented. But I'll tell you, the work hours, there's some controversy whether or not it's good or bad. I don't, we're not going to change it. And I think the work hours, having a life as a resident's not a bad thing to have. I think, so the requirements and the structure for training now is much more regimented than it was when I was a resident. And I finished my residency in 1988. The demands on the residents now, I think, are much more intense than what we were residents. We charted on paper. ICU care wasn't as half as intense as it is now. We didn't have all the tools, transthoracic echocardiograms and all these vasopressors at CVVHD. Those were uncommon even in a surgical ICU setting back when I was training. Patients are sicker now by all measures than they were when I was a resident. So I think the biology of blood transfusions is certainly a lot less poorly understood in my day than it is now. So I think we've traded off hours that were more intense when I was a resident to more demands for knowledge, and which I think is a good thing. I think, if I were to say the one thing that the residents are definitely smarter than they are now. One of the things that I feel that the residents nowadays need to focus more on is understanding the medical management, of patients. But maybe they do, and I don't appreciate it. But I think understanding physiology of hyperdynamic, the end-stage liver disease patient, understanding some of the metabolic, changes in kidney failure, things like that. But since transplant's not a mandatory rotation for residents anymore, like it used to be, I guess you can only expect to get some modicum of exposure, and hopefully if it generates an interest in them and they go into transplant, then they'll study up a little bit more before they come in. When I was a resident, when I finished my fellowship, I actually practiced sort of as a hepatologist at the University of Pittsburgh while they had a gap when our chief hepatologist left. I took over many of his hepatology patients to manage them until we got another chief about 6 months later. But I felt pretty comfortable doing it because I watched him and we rounded together. So, those are the kinds of things I think understanding not just be a good surgeon, but also being a complete doctor is something that I would say, regardless of when you train, that should be your goal.
Very good. What's the single best attribute you think a surgeon should have? And I know it's hard to pick one single thing, but
well, one of the things that I think all this focus on behavioral attitudes of surgeons. Surgeons are definitely cocky, but they were also ill-behaved in the past, and that kind of was expectation of what surgeons' behavior should be. That's not tolerated anymore. It was funny. I was just talking to somebody about this the other day. The stuff that some of the guys I trained with you do that nowadays and you're gone. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I think a surgeon needs what I would say the most important attribute, obviously besides the technical skill, is understanding, always having a plan A and a plan B and a plan C. Whether it be in the operating room, encountering something you didn't expect, or having a post-operative complication and being able to get your way out of it. Really, that appreciation for all the complexities, part of that you're going to get from experience. As you see more, you'll understand more, go to the meetings, listen to other people. But part of it also is really going back to what I said before. Once you understand, alterations in physiology, things that can happen, all the anomalies of anatomy and stuff, I think your patient outcomes will be better, and never be afraid to stop and ask for help. that you learn as you get older.
Very good, very good. And I this is probably not the right moment to say, but I kind of want to circle back. Well, so your father was an engineer.
Yep.
You built rockets. How did you land in medicine? Why did you choose to do medicine and obviously transplant surgery?
Well, I was always interested in biology. At one point, there was a point where I was sort of thought about the physical sciences. In high school, I actually worked with, just trying to see where this picture is in my office. There was a guy who was at UCLA. His name was Willard Libby. Willard Libby was best known for having gotten the Nobel Prize for carbon-14 dating. Yeah. I worked in his lab in high school. It was pretty cool. And so I thought at that point maybe that was what I was interested in, but then, and I worked also with my father in the aerospace industry. I worked on the space shuttle for a summer doing programming. So, I was kind of thinking maybe that would be interesting, but as I got through high school, finished my classes, and got more involved, interested in biology and immunology, which was a developing field then. So at that point, it was pretty clear I was going into medicine. It was a question of what field of medicine. And when I talked to people, and in fact, when I was here at the University of Chicago, as a student, I wanted to be a hematologist, oncologist. I was interested in getting into the vaccine field. Mm-hmm. And during my rotation on oncology, I just realized, unfortunately, I guess at that time it was mostly chemotherapy, and so that that wasn't really what I was interested in doing. We didn't have immunotherapy then, so with a Ph.D. in immunology, I was figuring out what I was going to do. So I ended up eventually going to transplant, and at the time it was new. Everything was pretty exciting. Outcomes weren't great, so basically anything we did was going to make it better. So that's how I got involved in organ transplant.
And I guess along that same line, there's no secret you worked with the father, I guess, of modern transplant, mm-hmm. Dr. Starzl. How was that working with someone? I feel like every generation there's a passing of the torch, and being able to work with someone such as that. I mean, how was he?
You learn a lot from watching somebody.
Yeah.
And this could diverge just a little bit about surgical training. People are especially when you're young and you want to do the operation. You think, why is this guy not letting me do the operation? Well, I tell you, there was a guy that was at the University of Rochester who had been the chairman here at the University of Chicago. His name was Rene Mengy, a French Vietnamese surgeon. And I watched him operate for 2 months on his rotation as a mid-level resident. I think I learned more watching him operate than all the operations that I did with, before that. And the same thing was with Starzl. Starzl was sort of an excellent technical surgeon. He, fit all the things I talked about before, kind of understanding, options and alternative approaches to problems. And watching him operate, I learned a lot. He wasn't going to first assist me, and I wouldn't have expected him to. But, it was a couple of years that I was with him and trained with him and, went off and did operations with him, donors and stuff. You kind of understood him as, he was not I'll do any case, all I want to do is be in the operating room. One of the interesting things he told me about surgery for him was that it was a means to an end. He wanted to understand a physiologic problem, that question that couldn't be answered, and unless he did a transplant. And so those are the things that, I valued a lot because, fundamentally, my approach to surgical issues and surgical problems are very similar. I think surgery is an excellent tool. I don't operate for the, just to be in the operating room. Some people do it and they do well. I'm not, knocking them. But for me, it was, if I'm going to do an operation, I really want to understand what we're doing. What are the, maybe not so much now that we know all the outcomes are going to be kind of expected, but I like new challenges when something's a little bit unusual, because that means that you have a problem, you have a potential solution, you have a hypothesis. If you have a new problem or something, then how can you fix it? So watching him operate and understanding his mantra, and sort of looking at his how he approached problems was really something important for me. I've tried to carry that on in my career. Right now, for example, we're grappling with how can we make liver transplantation more applicable to patients that have primary and metastatic, cancers. Yeah. So this transplant oncology is a new field where liver transplantation is used for cancers that in the past hadn't been considered. We transplant patients for hepatoma, but they had to be a certain size or smaller. Big hepatomas, cholangiocarcinomas, neuroendocrine tumors, colorectal cancer. Those are kinds of areas that in the past we just said it's not going to work. So, right now using new tools, new diagnostics, immunotherapy, selection criteria, expanding the indications for transplantation, to me, is what I think, I find that exciting. That's why I'm involved in that field. So Starzl and I kind of parallel that same kind of philosophy.
I think that's, at least I can only speak for myself. I do see what you're talking about. Some surgeons, surgery is like a sport. It's sport to them.
Mm-hmm.
We're all, I think everyone has a level of competitiveness, and for me, why I love surgery and what picked me up was, you get your answers almost immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And as sensitive and specific and accurate as your CT or MRA, whatever it is, you get your answers with surgery. And so I think I think you've eloquently put that in your last statement. I guess you kind of touched on it. What's the next step? I guess you are expanding sort of the criteria for transplant. Well, what's the next step for Dr. Fung? Other than, I know you came to Chicago to expand on this transplant program. What other things can we expect from you in the near future?
Well, I don't know about in the near future. One of the things that I've been very fortunate to be working with a guy, one of our faculty members, Piotr Witkowski, who has a lifelong interest in pancreas and islet transplantation. I got involved in islet transplantation back in Pittsburgh with a guy named Camilo Ricordi, who probably is one of the foremost authorities in diabetes, surgical approaches, transplant approaches to diabetes in the United States at the University of Miami. And so I've always had an interest in it. When I was in Cleveland, really not so much outside of experimental approaches to islet transplantation with tolerance protocols. But being back here at the University of Chicago now, being one of the largest islet transplant program in the United States here, with unique kind of novel approaches to managing type 1 diabetics with cellular transplantation, I think is pretty exciting. You have a number of protocols in that arena. Dr. Ralph Barth, who we recruited from the University of Maryland, very much interested in whole pancreas transplantation. So that program here has been a real plus from that standpoint. So I think what you may see from some of the work coming out of here will be in that arena, expanding organ donor use using different kinds of machine perfusions. I've been involved with normothermic machine perfusion now for well over a decade, and so we've been involved in some of the pivotal trials, and then application of that to our clinical program has been growing, so that's exciting. And then there are some things that don't really have much to do with transplantation, but I like interested in the biology, intolerance. So working with a company that's interested in using nanotechnology to antigen presentation deviates the immune system when you do nanoparticle coating of antigens to more tolerogenic type of situations. So right now where we have a protocol for peanut allergy, we have a protocol for gluten enteropathy, we have a protocol for primary biliary cirrhosis. So that's sort of being an advisory to that company. So there's different things that you can expand to. Challenge. It doesn't have to be just transplantation, but anything in the cutting edge. That I'm not a molecular biologist, so interests really are clinical trials.
Awesome. So I heard you were a chef. What's your dish? What's the dish that the president's coming over and you gotta make this one thing?
So I have, it takes me time to perfect it. I know what I want. Like my food, it tends to be a little spicy. So probably it's taken me almost 10 years to perfect, but I've got it nailed. I don't know if you ever had it. It's a Taiwan beef noodle soup. Now, beef shank or beef short ribs are cooked in this really savory broth with all these spices. It's taken me almost 10 years, and then perfected with the types of noodles they use, etc. So that's probably, I would say, my crowning achievement. But I make Peking duck. I do beef Wellington. I can do a big soup guy myself. I love to cook soups, make soup. So chili I bring in for the staff. a couple times a year for different functions. For me, it's just kind of experimenting in the kitchen, and it takes away. You don't have to concentrate on anything except in front of you. You're doing the things. You're doing the operating room, like cutting and stuff like that. And you're sort of experimenting. So it's a fun thing to do. And during COVID, since nobody went out for dinner, I just every night was an experiment.
Yeah,
cooking.
There's a common trait among surgeons and being a chef. So I can't make it quite yet, and it all depends on the quality of the fish coming. I think that's another thing, quality of the ingredients, just like the quality of your pickups. But
always keep your knife sharp.
Very good. Very good. That's a good quote.
Right.
Last thing, words of wisdom to share with just trainees in general. And I think you've said quite a bit, but from Dr. Fung by Dr. Fung.
You can never learn too much, and should always ask when you don't know. Or if you have the resources that you can look something up, that's great. But there are some questions you just don't know, and you can't find on in the internet. It never hurts to ask. It doesn't really matter where you are in your career. Just don't be afraid to ask questions. Always learn. I think people have different ways to learn. Some people write review articles. Some people prepare lectures for the students. Whatever it takes to get you to read. I find reading abstracts, reading manuscripts. I review about 60 to 70 manuscripts a year, and about one a week or more. And you learn, and I'll accept articles in basic sciences, to clinical, to whatever, and if I don't know something, I'll look it up. So I think it's one way to kind of keep abreast of what's going on. So never stop learning.
Love it. Dr. Fung, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure, like I said, this will be a huge hit for the listeners, and if not, at least for me.
Well, thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
That concludes this episode of The Sterile Room. Thank you for all the contributors, guest appearances, and of course, listeners. If you have any questions or concerns on the topic discussed on this episode, please feel free to reach out. And remember, folks, stay sterile.